Okay, good morning everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. This is the kickoff event for the speaker series for the Transparency and Governance Center here at Rutgers Newark. Suzanne Piotrowski, Director of the Center, Greg Gasco in the back. He's the Associate Director of the Center. This event and the Center generally is generously funded through the Pratt Program for Freedom of Information based here at Rutgers Law School. Okay, so I have a few thank yous. Want to go through first. We've got Sharon, Jade, Melissa, Denise, all of the staff who helped us. Thank you very much. A bunch of students. I think I'm going to forget some, Greg, but we have Kayla, Francisco, Eric. Anyone else I forgot?
Joseph, Maya.
Joseph, okay. We thank all of them very much for helping us move furniture, setting up. So today is, you may not know, the International Right to Know Day. Started in 2002. So we are going to mark that occasion with our roundtable on can open government promote good governance. And the center generally, and hopefully what we do today, is we're interested in the issues and the concepts of transparency and governance, but we also want to take a critical look at the concept and policies and practice of transparency. So we're hoping we can do that as well as part of our discussion. Sharon Stroy, who is the director for the Center of Community Engagement here at SPA, wanted to say a few things. So we'll have Sharon come up and then we'll introduce the speakers.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out for the kickoff event for the Transparency and Governance Center. The Office of Public Engagement in SPA is a newly formed office for us to collaborate more intentionally with the community partners, the residents in the City of Newark. Last Friday, we had a successful launch with 75 community organizations that came out and participated in a breakfast gathering to really find out exactly what you need in the community. Instead of us dictating what the programming should be, we really want to hear from our community members. We will collaborate closely with all of the centers here in the School of Public Affairs and Administration. We are scheduled to launch a speaker series. The next upcoming event will be on a public service lecture series on October 17th, where we will talk about the pros and cons of legalizing marijuana in New Jersey, as well as one of the things that we're doing for our municipal government is to develop some on-site training for training that is done on-site so our government agencies can collaborate with us, figure out exactly what they need to help move it forward. We have well-renowned faculty members with loads of expertise in this area, and it is our responsibility to connect the research to the practitioners. So we look forward to working with the community and our faculty members, and please enjoy this morning's discussion.
Great. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you.
Okay, let's do introductions. So we could start with Mila Gasco here. She is the Associate Research Director at the Center for Technology and Government and also a Research Associate Professor of Public Administration in the Department of Public Administration and Public Policy at Rockefeller College, University of Albany. Did I get that right? Yes, okay, very good. She's originally from Catalonia. She's been here at Albany for 2 years now, and we're so happy to have her in the States with us. She is has considerable consulting experience in the areas of information and knowledge society. She has done work for a wide range of agencies, including the United Nations Development Program, Inter-American Development Bank, International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, the Latin American Center on Management for Development, Google, and lots of other local and national governments. So we're very happy to have Mila here with us. Tawana Johnson, TJ, is an alum of SPA. She got her MPA here two years ago?
Yes.
A year ago? Okay, recently. She is currently the acting Chief Information Officer for the City of Newark and is committed to using technology and promote collaboration from stakeholders in creating environments that foster learning, development, and communications and ideas that allow for growth and innovation in the City of Newark. And we're so happy to have her here, and we're hoping this is the first of many interactions we have with TJ. Then we have Dr. Alasdair Roberts, who's a longtime friend and colleague of the Transparency and Governance Center here at SPA. Al is the director of the School of Public Policy and the professor of political science at University of Massachusetts Amherst. Al has written extensively, full stop. He's also written extensively on the topic of transparency. He wrote one of the initial really key books in this field called Blackout that won lots of awards, which I also realized won the Brownlow Book Award, which is funny because isn't that your dissertation was on the Brownlow Committee, right? So that was sort of funny. That was from the National Academy of Public Administration, and also fun fact, Al is the first non-American member of NAPA, and well, the first Canadian and the first non-American, generally, member of NAPA. Okay, Fredline M'Cormack-Hale is a neighbor here at Seton Hall University. It's also the first time we're meeting her, so we're really excited to have her here. She is an associate professor of political science at Seton Hall and the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. She's been there since 2008. She's a comparativist by training with a regional focus on Africa, specifically Sierra Leone. And Dr. M'Cormack-Hale's current research agenda explores democratization and state reconstruction in post-war states with a focus on the nexus between institutions and individuals. She has extensive experience in Sierra Leone. She was a Fulbright scholar there. And interesting to me because I do a lot of work on the OGP. Fredline sits on the independent experts panel of the OGP, which is a critical unit in that organization. So we're very happy to have all of you here. I'm going to turn it over to Al to kick things off.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity to engage in a conversation with our panelists today and with you. And it's nice to be a guest of the Transparency and Governance Center. You know, the interesting thing is that 25 years ago, which I was going to say is not that long ago, but that would be showing my age, you know, nobody would talk about transparency in government. The concept of transparency was just not a concept that you applied when you were talking about government. The word hadn't come into fashion yet. A lot of stuff we take for granted today, the notion, for example, of open data was completely unfamiliar for technological reasons a quarter century ago. Most people in the world didn't know what the right to information was a quarter century ago. Only a very small number of countries had something like the U.S. Freedom of Information Law, you know, maybe half a dozen or so. But the world has obviously changed in substantial ways. There's been just this radical sort of move toward openness and transparency that I think probably a movement, a global movement that probably crested about maybe 10 years ago, with the result that there are all these exciting initiatives that are about promoting open government and open data, finding ways of encouraging participation in the use of government-held information. But, you know, and it's also the case now that most countries in the world, a really kind of remarkable diffusion of a statutory instrument. Most countries in the world now have freedom of information laws. Most people living on this planet right now are in states that have some kind of statutory or constitutional right to information established. So there's been a sea change, but I think it's also the case, especially in the last 10 years or so, that there's also been a bit of a backlash, or a bit of a retreat, or retrenchment, whatever word you want to use. Governments and stakeholders worrying more about security and about the unintended consequences of transparency. So what we want to do today with three panelists who are coming at this from three very different perspectives is sort of have a little conversation about where we are and where we might go. And so what I want to do is I'll open up just by asking folks a couple of questions, and then I'll also open it up for you to engage in the conversation as well. And we'll see where we go. So I think the first question I'd like to ask everybody, and maybe I'll start over here with Fredline, is can you maybe draw on your own experience and tell us why open government matters, and do you maybe have a story that sort of illustrates the point?
Okay, thank you. And again, thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Center, for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here and to meet all of you. And thanks for the question. For me, yes, I think open government matters. I think this is why we're all here. We believe that it matters in some way, shape, or form. And I do work, as Suzanne mentioned, in Sierra Leone. And so when I think of open government in Sierra Leone, the first thing I think of, this is a country 15, 16 years post-war, and yet this is still a country where it's 3 spots from the bottom in terms of development. It's a country where it's ranked very high in terms of corruption, where citizens are, healthcare is supposed to be free for pregnant women and lactating moms, but you find a lot of them still saying we're paying for service. It's a country that suffered from Ebola in 2014, and despite that, there was a huge outcry because there's a lot of, there was findings that the monies for Ebola was misappropriated by the government. So when I think of all of these things, these are negative, but on the other hand, this is a country in March celebrated elections, the 3rd elections, with a turnover. So you had the incumbent falling, and this is quite rare, you know, in African transitions. Many times incumbent power, they're able to cling on to power. But here you had people who benefited from information about Ebola misappropriation, information regarding what the state has been able to do and has not done in terms of helping them achieve social development goals. There's currently a drive to take the government to court because of the perception that they violated citizens' human rights because of the misappropriation of funds for Ebola. People were able to know about that because information was made public. There was a looking at all the amounts of money that was coming from donors, tracking of donor funding, and looking to see where it was being applied, where the government was applying it. So I think that this shows you that despite the problems, despite the issues and constraints that developing countries face, open government has provided the opportunity for citizens, in a way, to hold government accountable and to force government to answer questions that they have. You asked for an example. One of the things that was done during the elections was there was data released at the constituency level in terms of how districts fared vis-a-vis who voted for whom. And because they released data openly at the constituency level, you were able to find out how people voted in communities. An organization that I am affiliated with was part of a bigger consortium, Standing Together for Democracy Consortium, that was tracking elections in Sierra Leone. What we did with this data was to compare voting patterns against incidences of violence. And we found that in highly contested communities where the race was particularly close, they were more likely to have increased rates of violence. And so based on this data, we were able to have a concerted attempt to minimize violence through sending greater observers there, through having discussions to mitigate violence, through having just a range of activities to try to ensure that for the runoff elections, because no one party had an outright victory, for the runoff elections, because of the targeting, there was an ability to minimize violence. So I think that's a good example of where you can see how openness did lead to change.
Thank you. Tamara,
Tawana.
Tawana, pardon me.
That's okay, TJ will be fine.
TJ, can you maybe also tell us a bit about what you do, and then maybe how open government connects with you?
I can tell you exactly what my team does, because I could not do this job without my team. And so we have about 5 different teams that are working into network infrastructure, data team. We have an administrative team, a data team, a network and infrastructure team. a broadband team, that's my project manager. But basically, we manage the internal and external infrastructure for the city. The data team is working hard to streamline processes within the departments. The networking team, I know you guys heard about the North Star Fiber. They're doing amazing things with nonprofit organizations in terms of getting affordable internet service to commercial and residential areas. So that's a little about what we do. It's really broad. So, but in terms of your question, in regards to how open data matters, I've been with the city for about 25 years, and I've seen it transform drastically from typewriters to computers to us actually putting the city's network on our own infrastructure. That's amazing to be able to do that. That's money that's saved throughout the community, and we couldn't have done it without citizens and partnerships with like universities and private corporations to say, hey, this is something you could be doing differently. Even the water billing system, you know, you had to come in, you had to pay for parking, you had to stand online. These are all things that you can do digitally now. So those are a lot of things that it just transformed the city. It made us more self-sufficient. We didn't rely on vendors. We didn't rely on just making it uneasy for residents. So and from that standpoint, I just sorry a little bit, but yeah, from that standpoint, I've just seen the city transform within the last 25 years.
And so, when in your work, what are the sort of major drivers? Is it citizens wanting better access to services? Is it them wanting more information to government? Is it just about getting folks inside government to kind of play together better?
I don't think it's the question of does open government matters. It's more is how we are pushing that message out there. I think there's a lack of awareness about what people have access to. We have a Newark app that we worked in collaboration with Roberts. It's about 1,000 people actually download this app, but it's like 280 people in the city of Newark. So they don't understand technology. They don't have access to technology.
What does the app do?
They actually, you can actually go in and get information about what's going on with Newark. You can actually make complaints and things like that. But the fact is that for a lot of residents, they don't understand technology. And that's something that the City of Newark has to work towards. That's not their problem, that's our problem. You got the City of Boston actually has a organization that they work with, that they post on their website about technology for the community, for small businesses. These are the type of things that the City of Newark needs to be doing now. We've already proven that we could bring businesses. We got Audible, we got IDT, we got these tech companies, big tech companies here. We proved that we could bring it here. We proved that our North Fiber worked. But now we have to get into the community. And the only way that we can do that is through open government, to allow people to say, hey, this is what you have access to. You have this right. What are your challenges? That's the only way that I know you hear smart city a lot, but smart city is only smart when you understand the challenges within the city and that you're using technology, that you're using data to combat those things.
Great, thanks. Mila.
So it's always difficult to be a third one. For me, open government matters, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be here, as you were saying before. And it really matters because citizens have the right to know. And we have the right to know because governments need to be held accountable for what they do. I always think of a country, and bear with me with this example, as a big company and citizens being the shareholders of this company. That means that, when the company does things, the shareholders have to approve those things. And maybe they're going to keep investing in the company, or they're going, in this case, to re-elect the persons, the presidents, the governors, whatever, again. So this is for me why open government is important, because citizens, we as a citizens, need to make sure that those people that we have elected are doing the right things, are meeting our demands, are meeting our expectations. And in order to do that, we need to know what information is there about all these actions they do and about all the things that they are implementing. So we need to know in order to make decisions about what's best for us. And these decisions are made through the election processes and for many other things. And in order to do that, we need that information. I was thinking about several examples of important open government experiences. And I'm going to tell you about one example that happened in my country, Spain, in the years where we didn't talk about open government, and this is 2004. We had a terrorist attack in Madrid, 1911 days after the terrorist attack here in New York, and of course it was because of our participation in the Iraq War, etc. And many people died as well. And the government said it didn't have anything to do with Al-Qaeda, while every other source said that it was an attack performed by Al-Qaeda. There was a lot of pressure from citizens all over Spain, demonstrations, and finally the government decided to release the correct information, the right information to people. They were linking the terrorist attack to our terrorist group in the Basque Country, but they finally, probably because of the pressure of the people, decided to give the correct information, and they gathered at the end of the day and released all the data they had about the terrorist attack. 2 days after, we were having a general election. We were electing a new government again, and all the polls a few days before had said that the government in place was going to be re-elected. It was the first time in history that only after 4 years governing, the government lost the election. Because of that information, people realized that they had been lying and that they didn't want a government who was lying to them and who wasn't accountable for the things that they were doing. So that transparency let the people decide what was going to be best for them, and they decided not to re-elect the government, despite they were going to win. Like only 1 week before, they were going to win, by a vast majority of votes. So re-election was almost guaranteed. And because how they dealt with this terrorist attack and how they first closed the information, finally they released it, the population made a different decision, and they were held accountable for what they had done. For me, that's an interesting example of openness, generally speaking, although at that time, 2004, we weren't talking about open government yet.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask the panel one more question, then I'll open it up and ask you if you've got any questions for the panelists. But the next question I think I'd like to ask is just where we can go next with the idea of openness. And so you can draw on your own experiences, and I guess 2 variants of the question would be, where are there areas where people really need information that they're not getting it? Or are there areas where you see really exciting opportunities to make the world a better place or improve the well-being of people by giving them information that they haven't got right now? Can I put you on the spot to start?
Oh, yeah, we're given the time to think. Those are some good questions. So, where are there areas that people might need information but aren't getting it?
Yeah.
And the second was?
Or do you see areas where by giving people information you could really empower them? I guess in the case of Sierra Leone, and do areas of everyday life come to mind where people are just suffering or not doing as well as they might because they just don't have access to certain kinds of information, or government's not telling them what's going on?
There's so much. I mean, there's so you could a book on all of that. I think what I thought was one of the things that I think when we talk about open government, and as I mentioned, I sit on the IEP of the Independent Reporting Mechanism of the Open Government Partnership. And I'm not speaking in an official capacity there, but OGP has seen huge acceptance of the idea of open government, right? Started in 2011 from 8 founding governments, and we are now 79 participating countries and 20 subnationals, and you have over 3,100 commitments that have been made. So open government has taken off, it's very popular, but the concern that I have, I think, is that too often governments are thinking of open government simply in terms of transparency and releasing of information. So it's just, we check some boxes, we release some information, and we've done our duty and made it, and it's open. Yet, if that information isn't, one, easily accessible to citizens, it's not in a format that citizens can engage with, can view, and then there is no further mechanism on how citizens can act upon that information. So not just the release of information, but also ensuring that there is accountability, that there are mechanisms in place for citizens to use that information to hold government accountable. If you don't have that, then it's empty air. And there was a report done by the IRM, let me just make sure that I get this, that said that there are 2 main barriers to increasing openness in government. One is low ambition of commitments, and the second is that you have 2 in 10 commitments that were not relevant to OGP principles. So 7 out of 10 commitments were low in ambition. What does that mean? That means that governments are simply saying, well, we're going to provide more information. It could be more information about clinics, it could be more information about sexual assault, just more information. And now that we've provided more information, we've opened up government, we've become more transparent. But then there are no follow-up steps. So let me give one concrete example. Sierra Leone has high levels of sexual gender-based violence. And in the 2016-2018 commitment plan, this is one of the commitments, to release information on SGBV. So there's four parts of the commitment: publish data on sexual violence on a half-yearly basis, develop a framework for forensic lab, set up the lab, and then have an online directory of sexual offense convicts. Well, one, how many people go online? Internet penetration is like 1% or 2% of the population. So publishing a directory of sexual offenders does not really help. Secondly, most offenders are people that people know, neighbors, family members. So how does publishing this really address the problem? A third issue is that even though the numbers of women reporting sexual violence are going up, the numbers of people that are being held or that are being punished or that are being convicted for this is not going up correspondingly. So that's what we need to address. Why is it that the cases are not being prosecuted? Why is the police subject to bribery and leaving cases out, or helping facilitate where you speak with the people who are guilty and you pay some money and you put you sweep the issues under the carpet? So these are some of the issues. Courts that are taking forever to prosecute cases. How do we get these issues on the table? How do we make sure that these are the things that are being addressed, as opposed to simply releasing the numbers of cases that have been reported, or releasing, putting online sexual predators? So that's, for me, is what I think we need to also be thinking about.
Can I just follow up on that? So a complaint sometimes made by leaders or bureaucrats in poorer countries that the whole open government, the whole global transparency exercise is a top-down exercise. It's driven by rich first world countries, and they're imposing their notions about how government should be run, and they're imposing all of these policies that are really sort of luxury goods of the West, like a freedom of information law and all of these open data requirements that are really not priorities in the context of a poor country. What do you make of that kind of argument?
I think that's an excuse. I think that these are priorities not just of rich nations, but of all nations. One of the things that I mentioned was the lack of access of women to free healthcare when they're supposed to have it. Or drugs that are being, government receiving money for drugs, but then when you go down to the community level, all of a sudden you might have had 100 million to procure drugs, but maybe only 30 million worth of drugs were procured. This is not a luxury for people. People wanting to know, well, what happened to the drugs? When I go to the hospital, I'm sick, I want to be treated. The drugs aren't there. What happened? How did you procure these drugs? What happens where you have a system whereby people who are responsible for procurement also have clinics on the side, and so sometimes those drugs make their way into private clinics of people, of policymakers. So these are issues that citizens care about. But what needs to be done is that you can have these very same issues that are supposed issues for countries in the West. You just have to reconceptualize them and rethink of how you provide this data, how you make this data open, how you engage with citizens on this. It can be something as simple, and we've seen national action plans in Brazil did this, and in other countries, Rwanda. You can have a national action plan where you say, as a service provider or as a policymaker, I will meet with citizens once every 3 months. We will have a roundtable, a discussion where we will talk with them. We will let them know this is what's happened, and then give us your feedback about how you're experiencing service delivery in your communities and what you would like to see done, and then commit to having action taken on those areas. I was talking to a colleague this morning, and one of the things that the Ministry of Finance, with this new government, is wanting to do is to have an outside party, the Institute for Governance Reform, to work on service delivery index to find out what people are accessing when it comes to service delivery, but then to also have another component where you can facilitate interaction between citizens and the state on the state of service delivery that they're receiving. So this way, you're closing the feedback loop. It's not simply providing information, but also providing opportunities to address the limitations and constraints that citizens are saying that they're facing.
Great.
So I jump
Yeah.
quickly on that because I'm not sure I agree with you on the fact that with open government, the movement is top down. I totally agree. In the past, with new public management, everybody was copying what developed countries were doing. But with open government, I'm thinking about OGP. For example, my experience is that Latin America has played a great role in OGP. Brazil was a co-founder, a chair. Mexico has been a chair. And those are, we don't have developed or as developed countries, right, in Latin America. So those countries are playing a major role in developing open government, and they're doing it from their own perspective, and not so much driven by what the US is doing, or the UK, or any other countries in the developed world. So although I totally agree that in the past it's been very different, for open government I'm not that sure that it is being that top down, at least in Latin America. I know the case of Kenya as well, which has been a pioneer in Africa, right? So I am not sure that pattern is replicated when we talk about open government.
Okay. And while we're talking, and where do you see interesting opportunities or needs to advance openness?
So the easy question is we need to open, or we need to make transparent those issues or topics that are of interest for our citizens. And I was writing here that in the end, what is interesting for citizens are only like small things. I've been working a lot with local government in Spain, setting up their open data portals. And what we found out that all these citizens are interested is in knowing the salaries of the politicians and the government officials. And that's why they access the portal. So we have all this information, which we think is very relevant out there, visited by nobody. And then the pages on salaries visited by everybody. And of course, that's like, if I may say this, that's porno transparency, right? Who cares how knowing his salaries really does make a difference. And of course, you can argue a little bit about corruption, etc. But in the end, we do care about little things that are not going to really make a difference and are not going to realize the whole potential of openness and transparency. So if we're very interested in corruption, and that's why we want to know about salaries, maybe what it is very important is to open budget information. And not only in terms of budgeting, but also in a few cases I supported, we open the invoices, so then the citizens can really compare what was budgeted in the first place with what was finally spent. Because the problem with transparency is that you never know what is left behind, so to say. So you have all this information up there, but you're never going to be able to know how much information is still kept inside. So you need to look for those mechanisms, or you need to look for that information that lets citizens compare what they say they do and what they're actually doing. And in terms of budgeting, and therefore avoiding corruption, having the final invoices of what the governments are paying is important for citizens to be able to make this comparison by their own.
Okay. So TJ, in your work, where are your priorities in terms of development, openness? Where are there areas where you'd really like to sort of see the city do better, or?
In terms of open government and open data, we're going to always hear these words, innovation. It's about transparency. It's about civic participation. And it's all great when we think about the information that we provide to citizens so they're aware. But we don't really look how the talent that's out there in the communities. You may not be a technical person, but you might have an idea because you work in a certain area. It might be healthcare, it might be a nonprofit, that you could bring an idea to the city, that we can collect data and start to think about, like, how can we challenge, how can we improve this, how can we make this better? When we talk about API portals, API portals are for developers. The federal government has a website, challenge.gov, that put challenges out there and say, hey, this is the problem. We're going to give you X amount of dollars to come up with a solution to these problems. We don't really think about what the citizens can bring to open data by putting that information out. I can't do the job because I would never have enough manpower or resources. So not only do I depend on my team, but I depend on universities. I depend on citizens coming in with information. It's a collaborative effort. Like, we always want to sit here and say, hey, here's the information, but what can we do with this information? We understand challenges because that's where the information is coming from. It's coming from the citizens. But now we're charged with, what can we do? What can we do now that we got it?
So let me just follow up. So we're supposed to be talking about celebrating open government, all that good stuff today. But when you go into the office in the morning and you're thinking about what your mission is open government the language you would use, or would you say, I'm about providing better services to people?
It's crazy. That's what I say. What am I doing here in this craziness every morning? But it's just keeping the day-to-day operation running because of the lack of resources and the lack of manpower. It's not that the talent is not there, but we have to find creative ways to do things. And one of the things that we've been able to do is create an open data portal just to get information out there to people.
Yeah.
And partnership with other people. I'm always thinking, I'm here right now, not for this conversation, but who can I connect with that I can make the city of Newark better? What resources do they have at their disposal that I can make better? So in the morning I come in is the day-to-day operation. I'm also reaching out to people. I'm also thinking about ideas and connecting with people like, hey, we have a problem here. How can we attack this problem? This is the data that we currently have available for it. how can we get more data? How can we make more informed decisions?
Great. All right, so let me open it up and see if anybody would like to pose a question, or got to be a question out here. Yes.
I'm grateful for all the work that you're all doing because I've been the beneficiary of open government work in my research on cities.
And why don't you just give us your name? And
Rob Snyder, professor of journalism and American studies here at Rutgers Newark. But I was struck by a recent episode in New York City about the rezoning of Upper Manhattan, where the city government, under the law, was relatively open about what it was doing. It wasn't perfect. The language they used was arcane. It was, I think, very confusing for ordinary citizens. But the relative openness from the city government about what they planned to do by rezoning land was matched by, what? Opacity, deception, and double dealing by real estate developers who were going to ultimately respond to and rebuild the neighborhood in light of what the city government was doing. And it struck me that we had relative openness on the part of city government, but really a very closed approach on the part of corporate interests in Upper Manhattan. And the mismatch between the two made for extreme anxiety among residents because they sort of knew what the city was doing, but they really didn't know what real estate developers were doing. And so if people want to fully understand how their city is being reshaped, open governance obviously is fundamental. But do you think that open governance means to be matched by openness in other sectors of our society if it's going to achieve its full potential?
so I'll give that question to the panelists, but let me just ask you a question. Is it your impression that in that story that government was actually weakening its own position by showing its cards when the people, the developers it was dealing with weren't?
Depends what you mean by weakening, right? I actually think that the community actually mobilized and reduced a bad zoning plan very effectively, often because some elected officials provided more information than the government had collected initially to demonstrate the impact of the plan, right? That the plan was going to have an even bigger impact on the community than the city government wanted to admit. And that I think, helped calibrate the ultimate plan that emerged from this process. But at the same time, there were constant rumors. You know who bought this plot? You know who bought that plot? You know who's been trying to evict tenants? You know, I mean, rumors, almost like in the era of high crime. There were rumors about muggings. Now there are rumors about development and kicking people out of their apartments. And it's the city government, with all its flaws, that was relatively transparent. I say relatively, but the corporate interests who are working at the same time in the neighborhood could be pretty secretive. And there was not much to require them to be open.
All right, does anyone want to pick up on that? We've been talking about open government, but it's not just about openness in the public sector. Anyone like
For
that?
sure,
Yeah.
I will try to say something. So I do believe in openness in society, generally speaking, particularly when there is public good involved. So there is this movement which is called data collaboratives. There are a few other names for this, which means that private data can be used for the public good, public safety, public developments, for those specific issues where in the end there is an impact on the public, then definitely private companies, other types of organizations should make their data open. Now there are other more internal issues that do not affect the public, they affect their companies, their operations, then I would believe that that data doesn't need to be released. But when the public is involved, when there is an outcome, there is an impact in publicness, then definitely private data should be released. And as I said, there are a few movements very timidly starting to do a little bit of this, of opening or trying to push the opening of private data for the public good.
Well, I pick it from a different perspective. I know one of the concerns, even that dogged the Sierra Leone open government process, was the idea that it was dominated by government and government-aligned CSOs. So when you speak about openness on all levels, I think you're absolutely right. Because what happened was that you then had certain segments of civil society organizations saying, well, they don't represent us, and the issues and concerns that they've brought forward aren't issues and concerns that are necessarily representative of all citizens. Instead, they're more in support of what government would like. So I think that there needs to be the inclusion of multiple voices, and often You don't want to crowd out the space and just have certain voices that are aligned with certain interests. You do want to have all people involved, and governments, again, I know in this example that you provided, this is a good example of what government is doing, but government needs to make a concerted effort to bring all voices to the table. And the principle of co-creation is fundamental in OGP, and there's now increasing emphasis placed on ensuring that co-creation is truly co-creation, where you're involving all voices on the table.
And by CSOs, you mean
Civil society organizations.
These are nonprofit organizations that are doing important things in poor countries.
Right.
And should they live up to a code of openness too?
I think so, well, yes. Why? It goes two ways. They're also responsible for helping to improve, as you say, doing important things, but they situate themselves as warriors for citizens, right? As helping to advance the needs and concerns of citizens. Well, you need to be transparent as well. Money that you're receiving from donors, where is that going? How are you using it? So I think that we also need to shift the emphasis from it always being state-centric to realize we are all involved in the business of development.
So can I just push that a little further? So if I'm a citizen of Sierra Leone,
Yes.
should I have a right to information that's held by CSOs?
Yes.
And what about private corporations?
Yes. I mean, one of the things that there's a lot of private investment, right? Private investment in the diamond sector, in the mining sector. Beneficial ownership. Who's benefiting ultimately from this? This is something that we haven't got yet, but something that CSOs are fighting for. Who ultimately benefits from these deals, from these transactions? So yes, openness at all levels. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So TJ, when you're talking about partnerships with folks in the community, do you sometimes get frustrated that the city is being open, but the partners you're dealing with aren't showing their cards, that they're not sharing information with you?
Actually, in regards to your example, I think that communities could change in the way that business is dealt with. You're not going to go to a South Orange, and you're not going to put like all these fast food places in there. We're going to do this, we're going to put this there, we're going to put this there. There's a level of understanding amongst the community that we know how our community needs to be. We know how people need to act in our community. We're not going to accept this. So when you have governments that's not willing to require or really push for any type of ordinance or any type of legislation to companies that deal with the city and do business with them, like this is what we expect from you guys. We expect for you guys to be as open as we are. You know, and if you're not going to be able to do that, then you know, this is not a good deal for the city. And we should not be looking at these. We're looking at partnerships to build the city. You're going to reside there. You're going to have to help us out. You're going to have to be able to do that, being just as transparent as we are, just as dedicated to the citizens as we are. And if you can't do that, then go to the next panel.
All right. Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
I would say open APIs could be the solution to your problem. So where you could take data from city properties, you could take that data and mix it in with data from real estate companies. And like she was saying, you allow the community to use their innovation, their skills, to put the two pieces together and come up with a solution for something like that. So an app that would take all these different data points and show you, look how many properties this company has bought on this street. You know, that's about it for me.
That's why I depend on my team. That's my guy.
Yes.
Hi, Mark Scottman, president of a company called 4.0 Analytics. So we are a local Newark-based company, and there are, TJ, you're absolutely right in terms of good governance. There's the issue of good governance versus government intrusion. But to your point of educating the citizenry of how things work, We are working with Newark now, and the great thing about it is that we are not transparent. We're in the business of transparency in terms of vehicle technologies. So more than just vehicle locator systems, but also the reducing of carbon emissions. That has worked very well in that there's a director there that really understands the concept of not only transparency but getting things done. So with his participation in the city's support, this past season they saved hundreds of thousands of dollars. But going forward, true, if we're not transparent, or if the companies you're working with aren't transparent, and then it doesn't work for us, because as a former local elected official, we do understand the concept of government. So I just want to say the Newark infrastructure and what they're doing now is positioning itself for some things that Newark knows about, some things that it doesn't know about yet, but is, I guess you'll be one of the first to know about. Newark is positioned to be the first city to launch what's called remote emissions inspections with the state of New Jersey. So no longer physically having to go to get your car inspected versus doing it remotely. And this is without government intrusion. So this is an example of a city who has been very proactive in trying to foster relationships that really solve local problems, but also have, from a sustainability standpoint, not only statewide, but national significance.
Great. Do you want to follow up on that? Or?
I would love to connect with you. And this is the beauty about forums like this. It's like you can get information and take it back and actually work with people and get things done. This is beautiful. And this is something new that I just brought up. So I'd love to connect with you afterwards and
Great.
talk about it.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name's Anna. I'm a Rutgers student. And I actually just learned open government last week. So when I saw this, I was like, oh my God, I need to get the information. so from the textbook, it spoke about transparency, and a professor asked us, an organization that helps with the open government. And for me, I think social media is like one of the best ways the government could use, because we as millennials, I'm very active on the media, and I barely watch news, I'm sorry. But I get my news from CNN on Instagram. And what they tell us is just a bunch of information that we get to understand. And sometimes they're over transparent, where we're like, whoa. And sometimes they're like really under transparent because they don't want to really tell us a full-blown conversation. And under the comments, which like allows the participation and communication, it's like a back and forth with like, I can't read on the comments, but sometimes I get pissed because some people don't understand what's going on. But it kind of like brings people together, but at the same time it divides people. And I'm saying that, is it based on the transparency? Should they like cut down the transparency of social media? Because sometimes social media do go crazy over the news. And I was just asking, like, is the open government a little too much towards social media because they realize that my generation is more to that side? Or they can just have like a better way of, what's the word? They can have a better way of informing the youth about what is going on in the government, not just through social media, but like an other way where we can actually get exposed to other platforms. Like, because it's kind of bad that I don't watch news, and I don't like it. But I'm trying to develop that kind of system. But I was just asking, like, the transparency. Is it how good is, I want to say, how much is still transparency?
TMI. Is it possible to have too much information, right? And it sort of goes, and let me just I'll open it up to the panel in a sec, right? But the notion 20 years ago was we're going to have this great age of transparency, everything's going to get out there in the public domain, we'll all be enlightened citizens, and we'll all engage in reasoned discourse, and the world will be a better, happier place, right? That was the theory. And now we're in the age of social media, and we've observed what happens to discourse And you were making the point earlier on that, you know, when people have the capacity to get information, what do they go for? Well, they want to know about salaries. And a lot of public servants say, look, you know, the stuff people are asking for is the sort of tawdry, irrelevant stuff. They don't go for the higher level stuff. They go for the, you know, prurient interest stuff. So, I mean, is it possible to have too much information?
I think we do have too much information. And not only from government, but from so many sources that interpret what government wants to say, right? That in the end we got bombed with so much information that we are not really able to identify which is the information that we really need. Social media, of course, has expanded this a lot, but for a while, and before the area of social media, I think we were already exposed to too much information. Like, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago, I wasn't born, but still probably I think of our predecessors just reading one newspaper, right? And all the information was there, period. Now with the internet, you can go to one newspaper, you can get the news from social media, and still you're going to Google something else to see if somebody else talks about that issue, maybe from a different perspective. So we have so many news with so many interpretations from so many perspectives that makes the whole exercise of transparency much more difficult than when we only had one source of information and we got stuck with that source of information. So yes, I do believe we have too much information, and that means that citizens need to be trained and need to invest in being able to sort the different types of information and make sure they get the information which is more valuable for them and for the decision-making processes they want to engage in, and to make sure that the information is really to strengthen their quality of life, which is in the end, for me, the goal of openness and transparency, that we can offer citizens a better quality of life because they can make better decisions about their society and the place they live in.
So Mila, let me push that a little further then. What would you say is the #1 problem today? Is it lack of governmental openness, or the lack of intermediaries who can help make sense of information for citizens? Or is it just the lack of skill on the part of citizens in dealing with the information they've already got?
So I think it's a multiple problem. So organizationally speaking, I think there is a problem there still, despite how fashionable it is to open information and to be transparent and to be in the movement of open government. I think that there is a lot of cultural resistance inside the governments. I was doing a study a couple of years ago, and I was talking to a public servant in the Netherlands, and he told me that it is not that they didn't want to open the information, but for years they had been told that data was so important that they had to protect it. And now with this open government and open data thing, they were told totally the other thing, right? Now data, you don't have to preserve data anymore, and now you need to give it to the citizens. So of course this change of mind and cultural mind takes time. And particularly, I don't know the case in the US, I have to be honest, but in Europe, the average age of public servants is quite high. So people take their times to change their cultural minds and their cultural patterns. So inside governments, there is resistance to change, to open information, to open data, not because they do not want to, just because they were used to do things in a very different way. Also, there is a management problem, like taking the example of social media. One of my students in Spain, she was a public servant. She was the director of services in one local government in Barcelona, actually. And she was telling me that with the new Open Government Directive the city had adopted, she had to respond to tweets and Facebook posts, etc., on top of doing her usual operations, right? So now you have a person with many more tasks than before, obviously the same number of hours a day, and with a management problem, right? Because she couldn't address everything, and she was a director. So she was in a position that she had to be in charge of, I don't want to say, but more important decisions, strategic decisions if you wish, rather than just, answering tweets or answering posts from Facebook. So organizationally, there are cultural and management barriers. Now, I do believe that citizens are not prepared as well. I do not think we can use intermediaries, but I do think that in the end it is us who need to make the decisions about the information we get and how to interpret this information. And as I was saying before, I do believe that we do have so many sources of information nowadays that we do not have the skills to be able to manage those sources of information. But very important as well, I do think that in many places citizens are not willing either to do it. And maybe this might sound controversial, and I'm happy to discuss it. But as I was saying before, with the example of only wanting to know the salaries of the people, many citizens are just not interested in this whole thing. There is no open government takes co-responsibility. It is the government who needs to be transparent, engage citizens, etc. And it is the citizens who do need also to want to engage with the government. And in many places, this is not happening. We read the news, we do the information, but we're not willing to collaborate. We're not willing to participate. And it's not because, we do not want to do it. Sometimes I am a parent. I'm sure many of you are. We work all day, we have to take kids to activities, to school, whatever, we need to write our articles, whatever we need to do. Then at the end of the day, we just don't feel like going home, getting the information from the government, what the government did, and then, writing a few messages to give them our input and our feedback, right? We don't just... And I am in the open government thing, and I do not feel like doing it. When I get home, I just want to, watch TV with my family, have dinner together, etc. So people, citizens at this moment are not being co-responsible. And open government requires co-responsibility. So we do have a problem on the supply side, so to say, and the demand side. And we still need to work on that.
I agree with pretty much everything that you said, because my dad really does not like technology at all. He's still writing checks and getting stamps and things like that. I'm like, Dad, you can do all this stuff on the website. He's like, nah, they ain't getting my information. I'm like, Dad, it's already up. You think it's like a little banker somewhere in the closet taking all your information. But for me, I embrace technology. For you in the back, you grew up, you're born into technology. And so I would say, everybody knows across the board there's too much data out there. So it's a whole lot that you got to shift through. But when you're talking about getting information about your community, find out what organizations are in here. Find out, get information from your city site. We have a social media site. So you would go to our site and click on the social media icons to make sure that you're going and getting the right information. So I think that's a big thing that we need to look at too, that we have to do our due diligence to make sure that we're going to credible sites. And if you want to learn about the City of Newark, make sure that you're going to the City of Newark site. And if you need to do extra research, then you do extra research, get enough places. But it's also the responsibility for the city, and I'm just talking from a personal standpoint, that we provide information to the citizens, help them to embrace technology. Being a resident, being a city employee, and having a business in a neighboring town. I hear so much about people saying, but the city is not doing this, the city is not doing that. I'm like, yeah, we are. And this is where you can go and get it. But it tells me two things, either that you just didn't do the research, or you don't know how to get to it. And every part of government is not going to relate to everybody. It could be, you want to learn about small business, you have a small business. You want to know about programs that the city is doing. If it's housing, you want to find out about that. One of my team members, like bringing, instead of town hall coming to the city, it's like the city is bringing it to town, town hall to the city. city to town hall, but you can go and get information about just about anything. You know, when we talk about open government, we're looking at it so broad. But me, I could be a healthcare provider. I want to see what Health and Human Services is doing. I want to see how I can bring my programs to the city. If there's a problem with homelessness, you might have some nonprofit organization that does homelessness, you know, that you could possibly be a case study for. So I think that's when you're passionate about something, you'll find time to do the work. I know that everybody's could be parents and in school and there's so many things that we're doing, but if we just take the time to be able to focus on the things that we're passionate about, we can add to our community. We can actually do things, we can make a change.
So what do you think of this whole too much information thing?
The context matters, that where we're talking about matters, because this is not a problem that we're dealing with in Sierra Leone. Social media, during the elections, you had a lot of social media going around about fomenting ethnic violence. This was in order to try to get one, when it looked like the ruling party was losing, people were trying to rally around to have them lose. And so there was a lot of not even tweets, not many people are tweeting, but you had WhatsApp messages, a lot of WhatsApp messages about you need to, the other party voted along ethnic lines, why are we trying not to vote along ethnic lines? There were pictures sent around of places being burned, and then when you dug into it, it was, I'm sorry to use these words, fake news. It wasn't true. That you had a very small minority of the population who have access to this, who then use this tool to try to change the narrative. But, so then you had a lot of people saying, well, the elections are really, really violent. But they weren't. You had a small set of people that were using this to create a perception that was actually quite different from what the reality was. So when you say too much information, one of the issues was too little information, because most people in the city were the ones that had access to this, but people in rural areas did not. So that's one thing I would say in terms of this idea of social media, to answer your question, that everyone's using it. Elite people might be using it in some countries. It's not open to everybody. The second thing, to your point about people just being tired, I see that both ways. You know, I know sometimes development organizations will try to put one more thing on a woman who is, you know, she's gone to the farm, she's gone to get firewood, she's gone to get water, and then on top of that, well, you need to come attend my meeting, sit down and give me your views as a woman. She's like, no, I don't have time for all of this because I have a life, I have things that I need to do. But then on the other hand, there have been more community-based initiatives where you do have people who are involved in so much, but yet are so either disgusted by what they're seeing, or are so passionate about the issues that on top of all of these different things, they voluntarily say, we will do this. I think where it becomes a problem is where development organizations try to mandate it and try to add it to one more thing that overburden people are already facing because of the assumption that, well, you really want to see a change, don't you? So you will willingly do this free of cost.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Quang Ting. I'm the third-year PhD student from SPA. And I have a question regarding the inference from political turnover. So maybe it might be good to have some comments from practitioners. The reason that I have this question is that we know in the United States, the movement of open government is basically from the Obama administration since 2009. And after that, we can find more and more implementation of open government portal at either state level or local level. But if I'm right, it seems that I have not heard President Donald Trump mention anything about open government or open government data, that kind of things. So I'm wondering whether there's any inference from political turnover, maybe from federal level or local level. And especially, we all know that the regulation of open government is basically from the Freedom of Information Act. In other words, there's no an act named Open Government Act. So when we encounter this kind of political turnover, we may have the potential risk regarding the consistency of open government data. So the question would be whether there's any inference from political turnover. If there is, how could practitioners to manage that? Thank you.
Anyone like to respond to that particular question?
It's a great question. Suzanne, you might have some things to mention about the US and what's going on right now in terms of transitions. But one of the findings actually with the IRM, independent reporting mechanism, is that one of the hindrances to fulfilling commitments is when you have political turnover. And you might have had a previous government that was very committed, and then now you have one that isn't committed at all. And so it speaks to the importance of having independent mechanisms to guarantee commitment, right? Like independent financing, to have a standalone institution that's responsible for implementing open government commitments, and really trying to distance it from the unreliability of political transitions. I think that I don't want to speak so much about what's going on with the US. I don't know, would you like to talk about that?
Sure, briefly. So with respect to the OGP, the US does not have a fourth national action plan. So the Trump administration hasn't produced a fourth national action plan. And you're right, that open government was really put forth during the Obama administration. But also there are lots of critiques of the Obama administration on how transparent they were. So I think we should be hesitant there. But also, political turnover is a huge issue. But in some ways, the decentralization of open government is a strength, I think, because it keeps going. It lives on in the different agencies. There are other initiatives that are sort of going along under the radar of this administration. And I think that's one way open government is going to keep going in this country and others at different levels of government, because it is decentralized, and that is actually a strength in some ways.
It's interesting. I mean, we're currently facing a situation where in one of our subnational countries where the national government now is very much against open government and pushing back on the subnational government that is very much in favor and wants to do something, wants to actually implement commitments. So there's a bit of tug and pull there, and seeing how do you navigate continuing open government where you're facing resistance from the national.
I would add the example of Catalonia in Spain. It wasn't about open government, but because political turnover matters not only with open government, but with everything government does, right? In the end, when there is a change of government, many things change. As well, in the case of digital government in Catalonia, what they did was when they approved several laws, and it was a consensus in the Parliament of Catalonia, in the Congress of Catalonia, so that they guaranteed that no matter who governs Catalonia, for digital government, they will respect all the agreements. So for 1 year, they discussed and discussed and discussed. They came with this Catalonian agreement on digital government, and nowadays, although the government has changed a couple of times already, still those commitments are respected. The governments do things a little differently, but the overall framework of what digital government was conceived and wanted to achieve is still there, because they made this parliamentary agreement, and all the parties represented in the Parliament of Catalonia voted for this digital government plan in the very long run. So it is, I don't know how feasible that would be here, but this is one of the things that has been done in the case of Spain to guarantee commitments around very important issues as digital government was at that time. We're talking in the late 90s now.
So I think yes, go ahead.
My name is Sebastian. I'm faculty at SPA. Actually, I study citizen-state interactions from the individual level. And my question is a bit triggered by the very interesting comments that TJ made about bringing government, open government, to the citizens. So my question is perhaps a little bit of an academic or abstract one. I'm sorry for that. And that is, what do you think whether open government has a backfire effect on social equity. And the reason why I'm asking that is, if government provides information to citizens, the types of citizens that access that information are very specific. These are the well-educated and that know how to access that information and to utilize it. And if Professor Gasco says that she is tired at the end of the day, I fully get that. But you know how to access that information. If your kid's looking for a school, you know where the information is. Performance information, you know where the information is on crime rates, and so on and so forth. Some parts of society don't know that information. And this literacy is among ethnic, racial, education, income lines, and it perpetuates social inequalities. So my question is, what are your thoughts about that, and how specifically you could kind of target these inequalities?
Great question. Well, I was mentioning Boston. I don't actually think I got my point out about that. They have work with a nonprofit organization called Tech Goes Home. And so what this organization does is actually provides education about technology. They actually get people to volunteer their location. They get people to volunteer their time to go out and teach people that are not tech savvy how to use technology and how to benefit it and getting things done for themselves and for the community, to research information. And so that's some of the things that we're looking at to do within the City of Newark, is to work with this program to reach out to those people that do not have the means to learn about technology or have access to technology. So I think that working with different partnerships will help with that, but I think that every department, whether it's my department or economic and housing, whatever your focus is on, whether it's health, we as the department need to be able to reach out to the community and come up with ways to connect with them so that they have information. I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
Yes.
Yeah, another way we're trying to do it is, like she was saying before, bring technology to the town square. What that means, like bring the technology, the information to the people where they don't really have to come to us for it, where they don't have to look for it or have that background knowledge to search. So whether we have like media that displays throughout the city, or whether that's just, Wi-Fi, everybody knows how to connect to Wi-Fi. And, we could send notices out that way, notifications, buzzes, information, data could be sent to the people. They don't have to come and get it.
Just to sort of follow up as well, there have been a couple of studies that talk about the role of civil society organizations, nonprofits, as intermediaries, right? So they partner with the city and then they focus on these specific groups of individuals. So in governance, you had something on this, right? So these nonprofit organizations also play a critical role in helping kind of eliminate or mitigate the threat or backfire effect of open government.
No, that's done a lot. That in Sierra Leone, there's a couple of ways. One is through radio, using the radio because that's widespread. Although what you will find is that women have less access to radio than men do, so that can be a problem. You have community plays that are done to act out information for low literate audiences. They'll post things on doors in remote communities, but if it's written, people don't understand it. So civil society organizations will will serve as the middle people in between going outreach into the community to let people know about what's going on. And then a fourth mechanism has been this taking it to the people, is actually having politicians go into communities and engage directly with people there. So you have a structure in the middle of the community where people can come to and then they can speak on policies that they've done and have people give feedback.
And I also, even with dealing with vendors, one of the questions that I do ask is like, what's your community involvement? Like, what are you doing for the community? And so once I find out, I'm like, how can I incorporate this into our city? Or they do, like Meraki, Cisco Meraki is actually, they do programs where they go out into the school system and teach kids about technology. Like that's something I could bring to the North Public School System because I work with these vendors.
So I'm conscious that we're out of time, but I want to ask one kind of big question for each of our panelists and just get a kind of quick answer. from you. So we're in a deeply confused moment in history, I think, to put it politely. And it's not entirely clear how it's going to shake out. I mean, and in the realm of transparency, you could say, I suppose, you know, there's this international movement that's dedicated to openness now that wasn't there a few years ago, and there's all of these exciting technological opportunities that are there to improve openness. But on the other hand, you've got policymakers who are maybe burned out or dealing with austerity, or they're worrying about security concerns, or we've seen, you know, the unintended consequences that flow when you release information. So I guess what I'm wondering is, if we're looking at the next 10 years, the next decade, do you think the next decade is going to be good for transparency or bad? Can I put you on the spot? Are we going to be celebrating the great stuff that happened in the realm of transparency 10 years from now, or are we going to be, is it going to be more confused than that? Can I put you on the spot, Mila?
So for this question, you let me go first, right? Okay. So I think it's going to be good, and it's just my first thought, because people are going to demand more transparency. When you get used to something, you don't want to lose that. So you're going to, as a citizen, you're going to be demanding more transparency, and you're going to probably be more aware of your right to know. But on the other hand, because of all what you have mentioned, there will be also more awareness of the difficulties that transparency leads to, that being totally transparent, not only because of all the corruption things that can be associated with it, but as I was saying before, the management issues, the security, the data that we release, etc. There will be a darkness in transparency, because we will also be more aware of the difficulties of being really transparent. So we will have to find a balance between that more demand for transparency, which is good, but also the details of making transparency a good thing.
TJ, what do you think?
I think that I've been able to see how well the city is doing, because I've been with the city for a long time. I think that with anything, there's this pros and cons. I mean, we see information technology do amazing things, and that's what it was designed to do. And of course, there are some things like cyber hacking and all these different things, but do not use technology because these things exist. I think that when you have controls in place and you actually understand the environment that you're in, I think that moving forward, we're going to be in a very good place.
Great, thank you. Last word.
I like the positivity, so I will go with this. In an ideal world, what I hope will happen is that, despite the backlash against transparency, is that we will see a push for greater transparency on all levels. So you mentioned this briefly when you talked about CSOs, civil society organizations, and other institutions. There's been an emphasis on government being transparent. But I think that what's less done is intergovernmental organizations, international non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations. We need to push them to be equally transparent. One of the things, I was trying to do a study on Ebola funding and how much international organizations gave and what they used that money for and how that money was divided. For example, did most of it go to your staff or did most of it go to citizens? You cannot imagine the amount of difficulty it has been to get that information out. And yet these are organizations that celebrate transparency. So my hope is that we are going to be pushing these institutions as well, and that it will not just be about government being transparent, but all the different organizations that have any impact in the development of citizens' lives, that we will push them to open up as well, and that it will happen.
So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and I wonder if you could join me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation. Greg, you get the absolute
I get the last word.